Now I'd like to bring up our next THRED Talk speaker, Patrick McLaughlin, who is with the Hoover Institution. Patrick, here we go. And Patrick's talking about regulations. Get ready, folks. California has a lot of them.
I want to start today with a bridge. Chances are you all crossed a bridge on your way here today, maybe multiple bridges. And the thing about bridges, when they work, no one notices them. No one stops to say, "Thank you, bridge," or thinks about the maintenance crews that made sure that bridge was working when you went over it today. Yet that bridge is carrying commerce, doctor visits, emergency vehicles, and thousands of small plans that only work because that bridge works. Now, imagine a government that builds bridges but doesn't maintain them, doesn't have inspection schedules, maintenance schedules. They put them up, and then one day they're gone. They're there till they're not. And that's when we learn the price of neglect. The emergency repairs, the detours, costs that are much higher than they would have been had just routine maintenance been scheduled and done. Now, I've been invited here today to talk about regulations, not bridges, but my claim is simple. Regulations, like bridges, are infrastructure. They are the operating system of a modern economy, and when they work, they can protect health, they can increase safety, they can protect the environment. And they're by far the most common form of law. At the federal level, for example, regulations are about 20 times more numerous than statutes passed by Congress. But like roads and bridges, regulatory infrastructure requires maintenance. And let's be honest, maintenance of bridges or maintenance of regulations is not a glamorous job. No ribbon-cutting ceremony ever happens when an obsolete reporting form is simplified. No headline is made that says, "Contradictory subsection removed from Regulation 203." But that work matters. Now, most jurisdictions have a process for new rules, for making new rules. There's public hearings, there's a chance for the public at large to send comments about what they like or don't like about the regulation. There's sometimes even economic analysis attached to the regulation to help decide what to do. It's a machine that's built around the crafting of new rules. It's far from perfect, but it's there, it exists. Now, far fewer machines exist for thinking about old rules. Rules that have been written for technologies and risks and industries that were relevant decades ago, but remain on the books. And when there's no cleanup process, these regulations tend to pile up over time, as you might imagine. And just to be clear, I'm not saying that old rules are bad just because they're old, that they're a problem because they've been around for a long time. Some old rules, in fact, are excellent rules. But others are certainly outdated and may be entirely ineffective, creating costs with no benefits. And the fact is, without a good maintenance plan, without some system of going back and looking at regulations and seeing if they're working, most jurisdictions simply do not know what regulations are working and what ones are not. Now, that's on the government side of regulation, making rules or reviewing rules. Businesses and the business community faces a different problem. Businesses, of course, don't make regulations. They comply with regulations. They don't comply with one regulation at a time. They comply with a full stack, Regulation A and Regulation B and Regulation C. And because these regulations can overlap or contradict, the total burden can be greater than the sum of each part, each individual regulation. And when rules pile up for decades, that can become a major problem. How big of a problem is it? I've run a project called RegData, the RegData project, using AI to quantify regulation across jurisdictions and over time. Got it at the federal level, at the state level, and at the local level. And one thing we've taken away from this project is the variation, both across jurisdictions and over time, is enormous. At the federal level, for example, in 1970, there were about 400,000 regulatory restrictions, which are the words in legal language that either prohibit you from doing something or obligate you to do something. About 400,000 of those were on the books in 1970. Today, there's about 1.1 million regulatory restrictions at the federal level. At the state level, In California, which happens to be the most regulated state in the country, there are about 420,000 regulatory restrictions. At the other end of the state spectrum, Idaho has about 31,000, and the median state has 122,000. So California is about 13 times as regulated as Idaho, and 3.5 times as regulated as the median state. Now, that doesn't tell us one is good and another is bad. It's just an inventory of accumulated regulatory infrastructure, a count of bridges, if you will. But the management question becomes unavoidable here. If your regulatory infrastructure is 13 times larger than in other states, do you have a maintenance system that is 13 times as serious? No one would look at another state's transportation department and say, you have the most bridges, therefore you have the best infrastructure. No, you would do a more serious investigation. You would ask, what conditions are your bridges in? Are they all essential? Are they obsolete? Are they going to stay in place when I drive across them? Well, these same questions, or some version of these questions, should apply to regulation. Let me give you a specific example. We're here in San Mateo County, so I found a regulation in San Mateo County that maybe deserves some questions. In San Mateo County, it is illegal to engage in some forms of fortune telling without a license. So this regulation dates back to 1945, and it says, quote, it's illegal to engage in, quote, clairvoyance, palmistry, astrology, spiritism, or fortune telling, end quote, without a county license. That license costs $2,400 per year, payable quarterly in advance. And remember, that was written in 1945. So that's about $30,000 plus per year in today's dollars. They haven't raised the price, but in 1945, that would have been the equivalent of putting the price at $30,000. Now, I'm not here to defend fortune tellers, but as a maintenance example, it's instructive. There's some questions that you might ask if you had a good regulatory maintenance system in place of this regulation. Specifically, what is the goal? Is the goal presumably to prevent fraud? If so, why is this a special license, not a general anti-fraud rule? Why $2,400? Why payable quarterly in advance? All these nitpicky details can be asked of every single regulation, and should be. Now, it's sort of a silly example. A rule like this is not going to determine the fate of the local economy, of course, but it's a symptom of a problem. If you look at a bridge, a single rusted bolt doesn't prove that the bridge is failing. But when you see enough relics, enough old fittings, enough rusty bolts, enough patches, you learn something about the maintenance culture there. And California, like most states, has plenty of rusty bolts in their regulations. For example, in California regulations, there's a rule about real estate rescission language that involves using the telegraph. There's an insurance filing rule that still imagines an application being hole punched, placed in a manila folder, and attached with an ACO fastener, whatever that is. It's not just California. At the federal level, regulations from the 1970s require human inspectors to walk railroad tracks and look for faults when automated track inspection machines already do the job better, quicker, and cheaper. So, are telegraphs the cause of California's housing shortages? No. Are these mysterious ACO fasteners the main barrier to innovation? Of course not, but they're symptoms. Let me give you a stronger statistic, the age profile. If you look at all of California's regulations, over 22% of them have not been modified in 30 years or more. That takes us back to pre-smartphones, pre-cloud computing, pre-modern fintech, and of course pre-AI. And when a quarter of your regulatory code goes untouched for 30 years, it's a clear warning light. What is it warning us about? What does California lose for letting regulations pile up for decades? One loss is growth and innovation. I published a study a few years ago that looks at the cost of regulations not just as static compliance costs, but as ways that businesses are forced to not invest in things that increase productivity, but instead pay for compliance. Those losses of productivity growth end up adding up tremendously. Cumulatively, the deflected investments away from productivity growth and toward compliance has slowed economic growth overall by nearly 1 percentage point. Now, when the economy is growing by 3% a year, losing a percentage point from that is a massive loss. The economy in our study could have been $4 trillion larger than it actually was because of the slow growth caused by regulatory accumulation. Another loss is affordability. This is fairly intuitive. Regulations cause higher production costs. Businesses have to comply, and that's going to make building stuff more expensive. And some of that gets passed along to consumers in the form of higher prices. This has been verified in several studies. We also know that state and local regulations can create bottlenecks in expanding the supply of housing. And both these effects, the price effect and the housing effect, are regressive in their nature. That is, they tend to hit the lowest income households the hardest. So what does good management look like? There's a few states that have gotten it right, but I tend to go back to the OG of regulatory management, which is, believe it or not, the Canadian province of British Columbia. In 2001, British Columbia set a goal to cut regulations by 1/3. They started off to achieve this goal by first creating an inventory, figuring out how many do we have on the books, so they could track progress. And then they set up a system that was very effective. They managed to cut 40% of their red tape, 40% of their regulations, of which they would say 100% was red tape, within 3 years. And as a result, a study I published showed that growth went up, economic growth went up by about 1.2 percentage points. Again, a massive effect. And what's more, British Columbia, after cutting that 40%, they stayed at that new lower level ever since. Here we are 21 years later, and they're still at that new lower level. They're finding ways, to, even as they create new regulations, go back and find old ones that they can streamline. Now, the point is not that California should become like Idaho, the least regulated state in America, or like British Columbia, or that old rules should just disappear. The point is, any jurisdiction with a large stock of regulations needs a maintenance plan. So how do you get regulation right? A few steps I'd highlight. First, like British Columbia, create an inventory. How many regulations do you have? When were they created? When were they last updated? Second, create a maintenance plan. Have a system that involves going back and looking at every single rule, maybe not all at once, but over a period of 5 years, for example, to see, is that rule actually delivering the benefits it's supposed to be delivering? Is it working? Has it become obsolete? Is it addressing a problem that's no longer there? Is it duplicative? Can it be streamlined? And then third, establish budget discipline. And what I mean by that is, similar to fiscal budgeting, regulatory budgeting means putting some sort of numeric, quantitative metric about how much regulation you have on the books, and then limiting how much it can grow. And you can set that limit in different ways. British Columbia actually figured out a really simple way of achieving this. They said for every new regulation that you make, you have to find an old one that you can streamline. And that was very effective. It was a form of regulatory budgeting that had very strong results. Now, if you don't have processes like these, then you've got a regulatory infrastructure that's failing. It won't collapse all at once, but it'll fail quietly with fewer startups, slower innovation, higher prices, and slower growth. I'll leave you with this. Regulations are infrastructure, and infrastructure fails when it is only built and never maintained. Thank you.